Just 4 months ago, the Rebel broke the exclusive story that the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, was planning on unveiling a uniform hijab, the first of its kind at a national police level in Canada. And this is something that would give Muslim female police officers an exemption from the normal uniform. They'd get to wear a hijab specially designed during the course of their duties. Now, this was broken back in January of 2016, just ahead of the RCMP's decision to announce the hijab. We obtained the information through people within the RCMP that were unhappy about this, and they were planning on timing their announcement with Diversity Week, which was to be observed later in the month earlier this year. Now, we have exclusive documents we can bring you today that the Rebel has obtained that show some very concerning details about the planning process, starting almost 2 years ago, about putting the hijab into the mix in the first place. Now, what I'm about to share with you has never been shared before. It's never seen the light of day publicly, but it shows some very concerning details. Chief among them, that political correctness has trumped the safety of police officers when it comes to the uniform policy and a number of other aspects of the RCMP's actual internal policies and rules. We'll start first off with an email from Inspector Blackmore. Now, this is a woman who was a chief really in the process of this. She was the one spearheading the campaign, Rhonda Blackmore. Now, she is in the Use of Force Division, and she was the one who, going back to 2014, when this first became a discussion, was championing the process along. And I'm going to share with you an email that Inspector Blackmore wrote to another officer in the RCMP, this one in the Uniform Division, in which she details some of the issues that I'm about to describe for you through other documents. She wrote on September 29th, 2015, all of the hijab designs we had tested at Depot created officer safety issues in that the snaps wouldn't let go before the force measuring device exceeded its capacity. As a result, we are thinking of a design that would have sort of a loose end on each side at the front that would tuck into the uniform shirt. The hijab wouldn't fit so tightly around the face, though, and I'm not sure that will meet with the religious requirements of the hijab. Now, that same day, Inspector Blackmore wrote another email in which she said that all designs of the hijab, all 3 prototypes, quote, did very poorly in force testing, unquote. Now, we got a copy of the documents that actually detailed the testing they did, the analysis they did on these, and it's really interesting. So they did a 2-phase test on the 3 prototypes they had, one with magnetic snaps, one with plastic snaps, and one with metal snaps. And what they looked at were how these handled under pressure. So they looked, for starters, on a mannequin's head, and they had someone try to pull it off, and they measured how much force it took to dislodge the hijab. And then they did, in the second phase, a more complicated test. They had people wear these and simulate ground combat, the kind that police officers would have to do in the field if they were to get into a situation where someone was resisting and someone was fighting them. Now, this report on simulated fighting revealed that all the hijabs, all 3 of them, required participants to, quote, tap out, unquote, because they were being choked. So they couldn't even do the test. They could not even get the hijabs off of people. People were getting choked so much that they actually had to end the simulation. And one of the people responsible for the testing in the report on this said that all of the models, quote, cannot be deployed operationally due to concern for officer safety while wearing the garment, unquote. Now, that report was dated May 27th, 2015. A few days later, on June 2nd, an intervention training officer with the RCMP, Steve Henderson, wrote to Inspector Blackmore that the hijabs posed, quote, an immediate choking hazard, unquote. And she had herself conceded that in the testing, all of them, quote, failed miserably, unquote. Now, what was interesting is that not only did the hijab fail because it was choking the cadets that were simulating a ground fight when they were using it, but it was also causing temporary blindness. They were finding that the hijab would be pulled over their eyes, and ultimately that would render them unable to see. So not only would they be able to be choked by a criminal in the process of a pretty standard hand-to-hand fight, but also they wouldn't even be able to see what they were doing in that case. And let's face it, the thing wasn't going to come off. The hijab was not going to move. And this was based on the 3 prototypes that the RCMP had spent over a year designing, developing, and testing in consultation not only with some of their force experts and some of their trainers, but also with representatives of the Muslim community. Now, one of the things that the police also did, the RCMP in this case, is consult with police forces that had already done something very similar. They spoke to a representative of the Toronto Police Service's diversity unit, and they asked about the Toronto Police hijab, which had been rolled out a few years before the RCMP was entering this area. And what they found from talking to the Toronto police officers should be offensive to any Toronto police officer. They said this: during their research into hijabs, it was pointed out that the hijabs are no more a choking hazard or officer safety issue than the dickies that TPS members wear under their uniform shirts in the winter. As these could be used to choke a member as well, it was decided that they would approve the hijab for operational members to wear, unquote. So in other words, well, we already have an issue with our Toronto Police Service uniforms where officers could get choked, so therefore it doesn't matter if they could get choked wearing a hijab as well. This is the bold approach to public safety that the Toronto Police apparently have, and their diversity department, not their use of force department, not their training division, not their safety units of many kinds, but their diversity unit. Because diversity has driven this whole process, not public safety, and certainly not officer safety. And we all know that diversity offices are driven by one fundamental school of thought, and that is political correctness. Now, the Toronto police, when they're detaining a Muslim female prisoner, what they do is they give them a paper hijab, because they know that in a jail setting with criminals, you can't trust what's going to happen with a cloth hijab. So if they make paper hijabs, why are they not good enough for officers in the field? The safety issue's there, and after all, if it's just about modesty, then what's the problem with wearing a paper hijab instead of one of these specially designed cloth hijabs? Now, while this was all underway, what happens if a Muslim woman wanted to apply for a job with the RCMP, but they didn't yet have a uniform that would accommodate her, and she herself was someone who felt she had to wear her hijab? Well, it seems as though the RCMP was basically, out of fear of being labeled discriminatory or Islamophobic under the Canadian Human Rights Act, deciding that they were going to just hire the person anyway, go through the process anyway. And this was something that actually came up in a couple of emails that were detailing what would happen if such a scenario were presented to the RCMP's recruitment division. Responding to the Diversity and Employment Equity Manager, Janet Henstock, Marlene Bdzell, a recruitment officer, said, quote, "Our message must be in keeping with the law set out in the Canadian Human Rights Act and cannot be dependent on whether or not official kit or clothing is available," unquote. Now, later on, another person, Sergeant Major D.C. Campbell, wrote that, quote, "Recruiting will be accepting applications regardless of the status of the project, citing Canadian Human Rights Act arguments. I'm not sure where the officer or public safety component fits into this, as recruiting may produce an applicant prior to the completion of the project," unquote. So the RCMP couldn't not hire a Muslim even if there wasn't a uniform available for them to wear. And that was perhaps part of the problem and part of why this process had to be rammed through. So why was it so important to ram through? Why was this, in spite of the safety issues, so important to put forward? What was the real agenda here? Apart from political correctness and the desire to be inclusive and diverse, we have a glimpse of this from Staff Sergeant Brad Reed of the National Recruiting Program. He said to a colleague, Troy Lightfoot, that the uniform hijab would help the RCMP meet its quota of having 50% women in every troop. He said, quote, "Including a hijab for general duty uniform is seen as reducing a potential barrier for some women candidates," unquote. Now, we've seen communication strategies, memos that were going back and forth between a number of stakeholders in the RCMP on how they were going to announce this, on how they were going to roll this out. And we've seen these that talk about diversity, and they talk about all of these different things here, and they talk about it as being a women's rights issue, a Muslim's rights issue, a religious freedoms issue. But apparently they are so destined to make this a choice that women have, they're saying this doesn't even have to be for Muslim women. In one draft of the communications memo, now this was not the final draft, for obvious reasons you'll understand pretty quickly, other female members can wear it in the course of their duties. For example, women who may be serving in communities with significant Muslim communities, or who may attend mosques as part of their duties or outreach, unquote. That was from one person. We don't know who wrote it. It was redacted from the version that we saw, but there was a recommendation that even non-Muslim officers, in the interest of inclusivity, in the interest of just going around on the general beat and interacting with people who may be Muslims, might wear a hijab, and having an RCMP issued hijab for that purpose was going to be beneficial. Now, the early drafts of the communications memo, going back to the late fall of 2015, listed two objectives of the rollout. One of them was to attract and retain Muslim women to the organization, unquote. Now, a revised draft, which ended up being the final draft in 2016, scrapped that entirely. The only objective they mentioned was, quote, to demonstrate the RCMP is a progressive and inclusive police service that values and respects persons of all cultural and religious backgrounds, unquote. Now, if it's so important for the RCMP to recruit and retain Muslim women specifically, hijab-wearing Muslim women specifically, why not be open about it? Why not be honest about it? Why take that out of the messaging? Maybe because the RCMP doesn't want to be seen as discriminatory, as pinpointing one race, one religion, one ethnicity, one sex, one class of person that it wants to specifically target, that it wants to specifically bring into the fray as members of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Now, the documents about the planning and testing and development came from spring of 2014 to fall of 2015. In that time, there were reports, testing, analysis of the testing, communications, other discussions about the 3 prototype hijabs. Now, on October 2nd of 2015, Inspector Rhonda Blackmore told colleagues that she was asking for other samples with modifications to try to deal with some of the safety issues that were well documented. And in November of 2015, Inspector Blackmore said she had these 2 prototypes. But not only do we have the initial testing, we don't have any secondary testing because, as far as we can tell from the information the government has provided, no testing was actually done. So the revised hijabs, the new prototypes that she had in November of 2015, actually had no official testing that was done in any kind, on mannequins or in ground combat. And even more concerning to that, well, she was talking about having these prototypes in her hands. The RCMP's communications division was already talking about the rollout of this. Already talking about the strategy on how they were going to introduce the finalized hijab, uniform hijab, to the Canadian public. And in these documents, just 2 days after we heard about the prototypes, this is one of the lines that was in the memo. The RCMP-issued hijab has undergone rigorous testing to ensure the design meets the highest standards of officer safety, unquote, except there's no evidence that any testing was actually done, nor has there been to this date. The RCMP powered through testing. The hijabs failed the safety test, but they still rushed ahead with other hijabs, with other untested ones. Political correctness has a chokehold on the RCMP, just as these government-issued hijabs do on those who wear them. For the Rebel.media, I'm Andrew Lawton.
Thanks for watching. Click here to never miss a Rebel update. Want even more of the Rebel? Well, click here to become a premium member.